I'm going to go into our first slide. So this is just something that you can enter your answer in the chat. How does it make you feel when you think about data cleaning? All right, so I see a couple of sixes. Actually, I'm surprised by the sixes. I see some ones, I see some fives. Okay, so this is probably good mix of 2 but 1 to be a 6. Yeah, no, this is a good mix of answers. So I guess for me, the idea of cleaning data is usually somewhere around the 5, 6 when I'm going to start the project. Then when I am in the project, I'm probably like 1, 2, 3, and then eventually I cycle back to 4, 5, 6. So I see like my data 6, others data 3. Yeah, like that's also true. It can be depending on whose data you're cleaning. So for today, one of the things that, let me just move on to the agenda, and we are going to be talking about cleaning up data. So I want to just make some things clear. What I'm going to be talking about is going to be very tool agnostic. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to do things the way that I'm showing them to you. I will be using a software called OpenRefine, but all of the things that we're going to be talking about really are more around the thought processes when you are cleaning data, things that you should be thinking about, considering, and other things like that. So it's less about click these buttons or enter these lines of code and you will have clean data. It's more about how do we think about cleaning data and how does that fit in with the research data lifecycle and with the data skills web. If you have attended other workshops, you might be familiar with that concept. And last but not least, I also have a full disclosure. What I'm going to be showing you is obviously prepared for a presentation that is 1 hour. So we cannot spend like hours and hours and hours doing the cleanup. So you're getting the Martha Stewart version of things. So I'm going to type in some formulas and they are going to work like magically. And that's probably not going to be what you experience most of the time when you are doing real data cleanup. Just know that what I'm showing you had a lot of trial and error behind the scenes, and just for the sake of time, I'm going to be just giving you like the answer up front. So just because sometimes when we think about data cleanup, it can be frustrating to iterate a number of times. And I just want to clarify that that's part of the process. Like the iteration and the things that are not perfectly clean are all part of the process. And if when you are trying to do cleanup, it's not as streamlined as I will hopefully make it look. It's not that you're doing anything wrong. It's just that I'm cheating because this is a presentation. Okay, so with that in mind, let's talk a little bit about the data skills web. So again, if you have attended other webinars in the series, we have been talking about how working with data really requires a lot of skills and a lot of activities that you're doing throughout. And it's not necessarily a linear process. It's more about interconnectedness between the stages. And one of the things that I really like personally about cleaning data is that it touches upon all of the other aspects of working with data. And we will see some examples about what that looks like. So where should we begin when we are cleaning up data? So when we're specifically talking about research data, our primary consideration should always be, what is the research question that I am trying to answer? And then once you have that clarity, you can move into more kind of logistics matters. So you can start looking at evaluating the data set that you have and decide whether or not that data set has the data that you actually need for your analysis. Is it a complete data set? Is something missing? And if it's not, if the data set doesn't have what you need, then maybe cleaning it up is not worth your time. Maybe you need to pivot. So the sooner you identify these kinds of things, the more time that you're going to save yourself trying to clean something that's not going to help you answer your research question. Sometimes the data set might already be pretty much clean and ready for analysis. Sometimes you will have to do some cleanup. And again, like that's some kind of initial evaluation that you're going to be doing to decide whether or not you want to engage and spend a lot of time doing any kind of cleanup for the data. Another very important thing is whether you have any additional context that is available for the data. So is there README file? Do you know what the source of the data that you're using was? Is there a data dictionary or other documentation? So all of these things will, of course, depend on whether the data that you're going to be cleaning up is your own data or if it is data that you obtained from somewhere else. But even if it is your own data, let's say that you're working with a group of people, with other researchers, and as part of a lab or something, maybe even though it's your data and you have all the context, there might be inconsistencies in the data entry element, and so maybe there still will be some cleanup. But the more context that you have about the data that you're trying to clean is going to make it easier. Then when you have like a first look of the data set that you're working with, you might also identify other cool data points that maybe you had not originally considered for analysis, but as you're doing an initial kind of assessment of the data, you might identify, oh, this is like a really cool thing that I might want to include in my analysis. Or there might be other data that is like, oh, that's just like very interesting, but it's outside of the scope of your research. And the important thing about those things is that sometimes we do find a ton of very interesting things once we start cleaning data and once we start playing with the files. But you always have to keep in mind what your research question is, and you have to focus primarily all of your energy on cleaning those fields that are going to make your research question answerable, as opposed to spending time cleaning up all the other fields that are neat and cool and interesting and exciting, but they are not necessarily related to your research question. So there's that. So again, just to bring it back to that data skills web, some of the initial things that you're doing before you even start cleaning up your data is planning and evaluating. So again, how is my workflow going to support my research question at the end of the cleanup process? So for today, I have created a synthetic data set. This data set was generated with AI, and it was intended to simulate the data format characteristics of another data set that I saw that was posted on Reddit. And basically that other data set on Reddit deals with information about salaries for co-op students at various companies. Now, again, if we go back to the Web of Data Skills, obtaining data, this data set was publicly available on Reddit. I reached out to the people who were responsible for that data set. And I said, hey, your data set is super cool. Is it okay if I use it for teaching purposes on how to clean data and how to work with data? And I didn't get a response back. And so at that point, what I decided is I did my best to reach out, even though this is a public data set. It was not intended for researchers to work with it. It's intended for people to have, specifically co-op students, to have a sense of what they can expect when they are applying for jobs. So it is not my place to just go and get that data set and start messing with it and cleaning it up in a webinar. So I decided instead of getting their data set, I would create my own data set, just replicating some of the interesting things that I saw were relevant for a workshop on cleaning data. So you can see the original data set if you want, but I'm going to be working with a separate data set that I created. And also very important, I didn't train my own data set based off of like directly importing the other data set. I had a set of prompts to help me create that. And all of that is available on GitHub. If you scan the QR code, you should be able to find the prompts that I used and the different iterations of the data set that I used. And the reason that I'm telling you on and on about like all of the things that I did is just so that, again, you have a sense of how data cleaning does connect to all of those other pieces in the web of skills for working with data. Last but not least, I will also mention that I did not attempt to replicate the actual trends and distributions from the original data set. So if you were to clean the original data set and then my data set, the trends would not necessarily align with each other because my data set is specifically meant to train people on how to do cleanup. It's not meant to represent reality out there. And last but not least, like again, the original data set did not have a lot of context, but it's just a data set that's meant for co-op students primarily to look at and not for more systematic analysis of trends. So we're going to switch gears and we're going to do some cleaning up. We're going to be looking at the data set in a moment. I'm going to switch my screen to the data set and to Open Refine. But here's like roughly the first things that we are going to be doing and what we normally want to do before we start cleaning up data. So first we want to do like an overall evaluation of the data that we can find in the rows. And then we want to do like a column by column kind of analysis. And we want to document everything that we find either as part of a README in the methodology section or as a separate file that is dedicated to the cleaning up portion. And we do this so that we, again, can get a sense of what we are dealing with, and also we can get a sense of how much time and effort we should be spending on cleaning different rows. Now, the data set that I'm using is tabular data, but these principles also apply if you were working with a different kind of data set. So let's say that you're working with, I don't know, textual documents like, I don't know, the works of William Shakespeare, and they have been digitized, and you are looking at the characteristics of the files. You would still do something similar where you would look at each of the files, trying to get a sense of what cleanup you might need to do, and you would document the kinds of activities that you would be doing on that file. So as I mentioned, for the sample tasks that I'm going to be walking you through, I will be using Open Refine, and I include the version of the software that I'm using. This is best practice when you are doing your own cleanup of your own data, to include in your README file, in your documentation, what software you used and what version you used. Because if you attended the workshop on reproducibility and replicability, sometimes as software changes, you might not be able to do the same things in the new version, or to open the same kind of files, or to do the same kind of tasks. And so documenting how you processed your data for analysis, how you cleaned it up, includes documenting which software you used. This particular software is open source, so it's non-proprietary, so it makes it easier for other people to work with it. But again, even though I'm going to be showing you Open Refine, don't feel like you need to know everything about Open Refine. If your own workflow uses a different software, if you use a programming language, if you use other things, that's fine as well. So I'm going to stop sharing the slides for now, and I'm going to switch my screen to Open Refine. So here's my data set, and So as I said, one of the first things that we want to do is just take a quick look at some of the rows and each of the columns to understand what we are dealing with. I'm going to maybe make my screen a little bit bigger so that people can see better. So if I go from left to right of my data set, I see that I have something called company and role. And there is the name of a company. It tells me how much the co-op student was paid per hour in US dollars. I see that the information is stated to be in Canadian dollars unless otherwise specified. There is also a column for benefits, for year, and for position. So if I am a co-op student and I find this data set, I can just take a quick look at the company of interest and I can see roughly how much they would pay me if I were working there. Now, if I am a researcher and I'm trying to work with this data, I will immediately notice certain things that maybe, again, if I'm just trying to get a sense, like a rough sense, if I should apply to the company or not. If I wanted to do some more systematic analysis, I can immediately see that there are some blank fields. So as a researcher, like that would be a consideration of what do I want to do about those fields that are not filled out? Is that something that impacts my research question, or is it okay if those were not filled out? Why are they blank? Is it, for example, in the case of the benefits, because that particular company didn't have benefits? Is it because the person who was filling out the spreadsheet forgot to include that information? We don't know. But again, like that's where the context and where your own research question would dictate whether or not you want to even start cleaning up this data set, because maybe if what you're trying to do is longitudinal analysis, looking at the change of the salary over time, maybe this is not going to be helpful for you. So you have to make those determinations, right? And then you go column by column, trying to identify some things. And ideally you have, again, some kind of documentation. So here I am opening up a blank text file where I will start making some notes of my observations as I look at this data set. So one of the things that I can see immediately for the column called company and role is that it's textual string information that I can find in that column. And I can see that there is discrepancies in the spelling. Okay, and I can also flag that this is something relatively easy to fix. So maybe that's something that will be quick and easy. And maybe that's something that I can just flag for myself when I start doing some of the actual cleanup. I also see that on this column, I have some parenthetical information. Okay, and so that parenthetical information includes province, it includes role. So it includes different things, right? So I will be taking notes, like very detailed as possible, about what the different columns have, so that when I'm going back and actually cleaning up that column, I am not surprised by what I'm getting back as results. I'm not going to go through all of the different characteristics of that row, but you would follow the same kind of process for each of the columns. So in the, oh, sorry, I clicked the wrong button. In this example, you have salary information. So you have numeric data, but you also have textual data. And you have time units. So for example, hour, week. You have currency in some cases. And you have different kinds of things. So again, we would go row by row, sorry, column by column, doing this kind of analysis. Now, in my case, in my example, let's say that salary information is the most important column that has the data that will help me answer my question. So rather than spend a lot of time fixing these spelling inconsistencies that are easy to clean, maybe I spend more time from the get-go trying to clean up the salary information, just so that I get a sense of whether or not it makes sense for me to keep going further with my cleaning up of the data set. But again, like what I'm trying to demo here is, in addition to doing the analysis, it's documenting the analysis, because that's going to save you a lot of headaches down the line when you go back to your documentation. It's like, okay, like this is what I was doing. This is what I was thinking about. And if other people want to replicate your results and clean up your results, sorry, your data set, and they want to see how you got to whatever values you got, they will have some information about that. So let's focus for a moment on that salary column, which is perhaps the one that would have most interesting data based on the contents of this data set. So there are many things that we could extract from here, and there is no right or wrong way to go about this, depending on, again, your research question. So one of the things that maybe I want to parse out to begin is I want to pull out all of the data related to the currency. So which ones are Canadian and which ones are USD. So depending on what tool you're using, there will be different ways of doing this. In Open Refine, the way that I would do this is I would create a new column based on this column. And now you don't really need to know a ton about GREL. You don't need to know a lot about like all of the technical steps that I'm going to be doing. But I'm just going to, again, Martha Stewart this for you. And I'm going to enter the formula that I'm going to be using. And this is relatively straightforward for you to understand, I would think. So if the value on that column contains the word or the letters USD, then create the new column that says USD. Otherwise, create the value CAD. Now, I'm making this assumption because the name of the column specifically tells me that the value is Canadian dollars unless otherwise specified. So this is an assumption that has already been clarified by the data set. If there was no information about which other currencies might be present in the data set, then maybe this approach would not work. But for now, this is going to work, and you can see here a preview of what this might look like. So I'm going to call my new column, I'm going to call it currency. And now I have that data pulled separately, as opposed to having everything in a single cluster of text and numbers. So one other thing that we might want to do is we might want to actually obtain all of the numeric values that are present here. Specifically, like we want to know how much the students were paid. Now, when I start to look at the numeric values, I immediately identify a number of issues. So some of the values will have decimal point and some of them don't. And those are all things that I should have at some point documented in my little note-taking that I was doing at the beginning. I see that some of those values are numeric values are ranges. And I also see that some of those numeric values maybe have, let me look for an example. Some of those values maybe have a comma to delimit the thousands. So there are different things happening with the numeric values. I also see that some of these things have commas because they have entered multiple options depending on which co-op term they were working. So I could separate all of these into their own columns, but if I try to separate by comma, what would happen is that I would also separate that 7,000 because there is a comma there. So I have to somehow address all of this mess. So how can we go about doing this? The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm just going to filter and find all of the cells that actually have a comma. And so I can see that this one has a comma that is related to the thousands. This one has a comma that is related to the thousands, but it also has a comma that is related to multiple values being present on the cell. So I have 32 such cases. Now, at this point, I'm going to pivot back to the PowerPoint slides because I'm going to talk to you about something called regular expressions, which if you have not come across before, they are really a superpower in the world of cleaning up data. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about those. So we're trying to get rid of that comma. And if the world was perfect and we had identical values, so like everything is 45,000 with that comma, and I just want to get rid of it, a simple find and replace that is present in a lot of software, including Word, Excel, find and replace is very helpful. And there's different ways that you could go about it. You could find 45, comma, 3 zeros and replace, or you could just find the comma and replace with nothing, and it would get you the same kind of thing. And this is because we can consistently predict what our data looks like. Now, we have a little bit of problem where there's not that cleanly delimited ways of us to know what's happening here. So it's not a consistent thing that we can just delete the comma, because again, in our example, if I delete that comma, it would delete also the one that is separating multiple values. So that's where regular expressions become extremely helpful. And what regular expressions are, basically, it's an advanced form of find and replace that instead of working with specific characters or numbers, it works with patterns that we identify and then we transform based on those patterns. So for example, the pattern that I can identify in the data set is that there is a number, any number, at least one, but sometimes there's two numbers, and those are followed by a comma. And then after the comma, there is more numbers. At least one number, usually it's 3 numbers, okay? So I think about this pattern and I kind of write it down in plain language. And so if I follow this pattern, you will notice that this comma here and this comma here and the very last row, they are not highlighted because they don't follow the pattern. There are numbers, but they are not immediately followed by comma, and the commas are not immediately followed by other numbers. So they don't match the pattern, so they won't be cleaned up when I do my regular expression. So now we translate all of that plain language to some more kind of like notation for regular expressions. So to talk about any number or digit that appears at least one time, this is how we would say that in regular expressions. So the D stands for digit, and this slash means that we are not looking for the letter D, but we are looking for a digit. And the plus sign, it means that it has to at least exist one time in our data. Then we have a comma, and as you see, we also escape that comma to indicate to the regular expression that we are looking for this as a character and not as a special computer instruction, and then followed by any number at least one time. So that's our regular expression. And then we take that and then we group it. So we make 3 groups, 1, 2, 3. And the reason we make these groups is because we want to get rid of something. We want to get rid of the second group. We want to get rid of that comma. So the way that we would do this in practice, once we have identified the pattern, once we have grouped it, is we would actually find that pattern, and then we would replace it. So we would replace with the first part, the second part, removing the comma, okay? So let's go back and let's do that in Open Refine. So I am going to do that replacement. So I am going to just copy and paste. I'm going to indicate that this is a regular expression, and I'm going to replace it with 1 and 3. So I don't care about the comma. And now when I hit OK, I can see that the only commas left in my data set are the commas that are actually splitting multiple values. But the ones that were used for thousands, those commas are gone. Okay? So again, this is probably as technical as we will get today. And there is tons of resources out there related to regular expressions. So don't worry that you need to know this right away. And again, like sometimes it will take iteration for you to be able to build a proper regular expression. But just as long as you're familiar with the concept of regular expressions, it would be very helpful for you going forward as you work on doing data cleanup. So I got rid of that comma so that I'm one step closer to being able to extract the numeric data that I'm looking for. So I am going to extract that data similar to how I extracted the currency. So I'm going to go add a new column based on this. And again, I'm just going to mark as steward for you what we need to do. And here you will see another example of a regular expression. I'm not going to go into too much detail about it, but you will see that I'm looking for numbers at least one time. Maybe there is a period for the decimals. Maybe there's more numbers. And then I'm going to extract that value. Okay. So I'm just going to go ahead and click OK. And that's going to get me, oh, I didn't enter the column name. So I'm going to enter the column name. And now I have my amount. And I can make this into numeric data. So the data type is important. So now I got some numbers out of this, and I have the currency. Now pay attention because, again, in this example, we have 3 different values, and I only extracted the first one. So that's something that you want to, again, be familiar with your data set. In this case, there is a range of numbers, and it only extracted the first one. So those are things that maybe I would flag to go back later and do additional cleanup. Again, right now, because this is just a quick show and tell for the purposes of the workshop, I am just kind of giving you some ideas of things that you might be doing and thinking about as you go about your data cleanup. But the purpose is not that by the end of this workshop, you are going to have 100% perfectly cleaned data set. The last thing that I am going to do for this column before we move to something else is I am going to extract the time unit. So we have hours, we have months, we have weeks. I'm going to extract those. Again, I'm going to be using a formula that I have already looked for. And basically in this one, what I am looking for is I am looking for that / and for any text that is right after the /. So there's more regular expressions there, which are basically looking for that / and any text that appears immediately after. So I'm going to call this time unit. Okay. And I have my time unit column now. From here, again, other things that you would be thinking about as you are doing this cleanup is how are you going to do the analysis? Perhaps it would be helpful to convert everything to a single currency. So perhaps you would go to the Bank of Canada and look at the annual exchange rates and use those to convert everything from US dollars to Canadian, because we are looking at Canadian students, and maybe that's the best approach. Maybe you would want to think, how are you going to reconcile the fact that some data is reported in hours, some data is reported in weeks? Are you going to create subsets from your data to do those kinds of analyses? We don't necessarily know how many hours per week they work when they have weekly rates. So those are all questions that you would have to be thinking about as you continue to do your cleanup. I'm going to move to this first one because, again, this has some of the easier, quote unquote, things to fix. So as we identified, there is inconsistent capitalization, there is parenthetical information. So maybe the first thing that I'm just going to do for a quick thing is I'm going to split into several columns, and I'm going to use the parentheses as my separator. And that way, now I have only company names on the first column and everything else is in my second column. The next thing that I can do is start to normalize the spelling of the companies. And again, like this depends on which software you are using. In my case, I have a function called cluster and edit, and it will find things that look similar, and it will suggest what the new cell value can be. So I'm going to just accept all of these ones. And I'm just going to merge and close. And as you can see now, all of these are normalized to the same kind of spelling. So from here, if I wanted, I could go ahead and I could do more cleanup here. So for example, if I were to cluster this, maybe I could normalize everything. Instead of Alberta office, I can just normalize it to Alberta. I could normalize this to British Columbia, and so on and so forth. Ontario, Alberta. I'm not going to do everything, but you get the idea. And then from there, I can split into several columns. And I have the province data. Okay. And again, like you would iterate through all of these cleaning up stages, but the gist of it is the first column that we focused on, the first thing that we focused on is where the majority of our important data is. We extracted as much data as we could, and then we moved on to some of the easier things to fix, which is the normalization of the capitalization, splitting some of the information that is in parentheses, and things like that. Okay, so I'm just being mindful of the time. I'm not going to clean anything else on this data set. One thing that I'm going to point out specifically for OpenRefine is that we have the option to extract a JSON file, which basically contains all of the different steps and all of the different things that I did. So this could be part of my documentation so that if somebody else wants to understand what I was doing, which different operations I did, they would be able to see that. Also, when I export this JSON file, I can send you a copy of that JSON file. And if you have a similar data set that has similar structure, you can run all of the things that I already identified, and it would help you clean your own data set using this JSON file. So this is a good way to document all of the things that you're doing as you go. It's done for you automatically. So just FYI, but again, you may not be using OpenRefine, you may be using other software. So documenting your process is very important. Okay, so I'm going to just go back to our slideshow for a little bit of wrapping up, as we want some time for questions and answers. So now that you have seen a little bit of the data set that we had, that some of the thought processes that went into cleaning it up, the question that you can type your answer in the chat if you feel so inclined. If you had to recreate this data set from scratch, what would you do differently? And this is mostly thinking about that connection between planning, evaluating, and cleaning data, like how all of those things are interrelated. Now that you know other things about how the data is messy, what things would you do differently from the get-go before you get to the stage where you have to clean up the data? And I'm going to just give a couple of moments if you want to type anything in the chat. And then I will move to the next slide where I have some of my suggestions. Start the blank data sheet with the columns that we need, like currency, unit of time, etc. So yes, exactly that. So we had to spend a lot of time separating data from the different columns. It would be much easier if from the get-go we already have all those data points in the different columns that we want. Then it says, force the user not to put multiple pieces info in a cell. That's also a very good observation. So use data conventions, standardized data entry processes, absolutely. So force some columns to be certain type, so integer, string. So yeah, absolutely. So all of those things definitely are things that would help your life, that would make your life more doable when you get to the point of cleaning up data, because you would have things more parsed out in a better way. So some of the considerations that I included: separating data points into their own columns, which was already mentioned. Data entry validation. Maybe you have mandatory fields, the year. If that's like super important, you cannot absolutely allow for anyone to enter data if they don't enter a year. And of course, like the other forcing columns to have certain types, standardized data entry processes. So all of those things. Documentation, again, describing your data, naming your files, and thinking about what will happen when you share your data in terms of reproducibility and replicability. So all of the things that we are doing are in the interest of answering a research question, but also about being transparent about how we got to our conclusions by means of the cleanup process. Because in the cleanup process, again, we identified a lot of things that were missing values. And when we do our analysis, we have to be transparent about the fact that there were missing values and how did we handle those, right? How did we handle duplicate values, things like that. Somebody else in the chat, data quality process to avoid data cleanup and data wrangling. Yeah, absolutely. So know that even when we have identified all of those things, and even though you have a great list of things that you have suggested as potential ways to reduce the work during data cleanup, we are at the end of the day humans, and we will make mistakes. And especially when you start working with labs and larger groups of people, as much as you try to standardize things, sometimes there will be inconsistencies, but at least having things planned out from the beginning is going to hopefully make your life easier, and it's going to hopefully make your cleaning process a little bit more streamlined than trying to, as you said, like data wrangle after the fact. Now, this is only possible in situations where you were responsible for creating the data set. Unfortunately, It's not always the case, and sometimes you will have to be working with data that was created by somebody else. But again, that's where that planning and that initial evaluation is going to be very helpful to just even get a sense of what am I looking at before I start trying to click buttons and before I start trying to write code to clean things up. Just having like that initial sense. Dreams of not having to clean and wrangle lap worth of data. Yeah, absolutely. But anyway, so just like things for you to kind of think about. And with that, I'm going to end the presentation and open it up for any questions, comments, things that you might have wanted a